Have you ever wondered what someone like Carl Jung, one of the most profound minds in psychology, might have said about death? When he knew his own was near, now imagine this. What if Jung had one final revelation, something so personal, so transformative, that he chose to speak it out loud, but never wrote it down? This isn't just speculation. According to those closest to him, Jung shared something in his final days, a quiet conversation about death that he never intended for books or lectures. Not because it lacked importance, but because some truths he believed should only be passed down soul to soul, voice to voice. Today we're going to open that door, because within that final conversation lies a message about the afterlife, the soul, and what really happens when we die, one that even his most famous works didn't capture. And yet, it could change everything we think we know. If you've ever felt that death isn't an end, but a transition, if you've ever had a dream, a vision, or a moment of stillness that felt like more than just coincidence, then what Jung shared may feel strangely familiar to you. So stay with me, because in the next few minutes, we're going to dive into the last thing Carl Jung ever revealed and explore the reason he may have never written it down. Let's go back to the year 1944. Carl Jung, already a world-renowned psychoanalyst, known for concepts like the shadow, the anima, the self, and the collective unconscious, suddenly suffers a massive heart attack. He's 68 years old. His body collapses. He's rushed to the hospital. What happens next isn't just a medical event. It becomes a spiritual turning point that even Jung's most devoted readers rarely hear about. While unconscious and hovering between life and death, Jung experiences what can only be described as a profound near-death vision. And no, this isn't the white light tunnel or out-of-body cliché that's been commercialized over time. This is different. In his own words, he finds himself drifting far above the earth, looking down at the planet, feeling completely detached from his physical self, and yet more real than ever before. He sees a temple massive, glowing sacred, a place that feels not only ancient, but somehow beyond time. And as he approaches it, Jung feels something incredible: clarity, peace, truth. The kind of truth that isn't explained in books, it's felt in your bones. And just as he's about to enter, something stops him. A force, a voice, a knowing. It's not your time yet. Jung wakes up in his hospital bed, weak, disoriented, changed. Now here's where it gets really interesting. After his recovery, Jung starts talking to those close to him about what he saw. Not in detail, not in public, but enough to know it had a deep impact. He would later write a little about this vision in his memoir, Memories, Dreams, Reflections. But what he shares there is only the surface. Privately, he told close friends and colleagues that what he experienced wasn't a hallucination. It wasn't a trick of the brain. It was something else, something real, something sacred. But he also admitted that some of what he saw, he would never write down. Why? Because some truths he believed are too deep for paper, too personal for psychology, and perhaps too powerful to be exposed without the proper inner preparation. From that moment on, Carl Jung began to shift, not in his scientific rigor, but in his spiritual orientation. You see, throughout most of his career, Jung tried to balance two worlds: the measurable world of clinical psychology and the mysterious world of dreams, myths, symbols, and the soul. And up until then, he had done a remarkable job staying on that tightrope. But after 1944, something changed. Jung began to step away from public debates and arguments with other scientists. He no longer cared to prove himself to the academic world. Instead, he turned inward more than ever before and began to view death not as an ending, but as a transformation. a sacred return. And that's a radical shift. Most of us are taught to see death as a termination, a vanishing point. But Jung started seeing it more like a homecoming, a psychological process, a reunification with something larger than the ego, larger than the body. He called it the final individuation. Now, if you're not familiar with the term individuation, here's what it means in Jung's view. Our life's purpose is to become whole, to integrate all parts of ourselves, our light, our shadow, our instincts, our divine spark into a unified self. Most of us spend our lives dancing around fragments of identity. But individuation is what happens when we finally bring them together. It's the soul's return to center. And Jung believed that death was not the failure of this journey, it was the completion. Can you imagine that? That everything you've struggled with in life, your fears, your traumas, your longing for meaning, was actually preparation for a sacred transformation. That death isn't something to be feared, but something to be understood as the next step in the soul's evolution. This wasn't just comforting to Jung. It was revelatory. He began to see symbols of death and rebirth everywhere in religious texts, in dreams, in mythology. He once wrote, "What happens after death is so unspeakably glorious that our imagination and our feelings do not suffice to form even an approximate conception of it." But again, much of this wasn't published in academic journals. It was spoken in private in trust to those he believed could handle it. Because Jung knew that the modern world wasn't ready to hear this truth, not from a man of science. Not yet. So why does this matter today? Because we live in a world obsessed with data certainty and proof. But Jung, who stood at the intersection of science and the soul, risked his legacy to whisper something different. That the greatest truth he ever encountered may be one he never dared to write down. And perhaps that's exactly why we need to listen more closely. Let this sink in. What if your own fears about death are not warnings, but invitations? What if the strange dreams you've had, the feelings of déjà vu, the sense that there's something more, are all little echoes of that same sacred temple Jung saw? Maybe you're not just imagining it. Maybe, like Jung, you're being reminded that you were never just a body. You were a soul preparing for return. Let's fast forward to the final days of Carl Jung's life. He's not giving lectures anymore. He's not writing. He's not entertaining debates. The man who once dissected the architecture of the human psyche now finds himself in a quieter space, physically frail, but inwardly luminous. And it's in this stillness something sacred happens. According to those closest to him, some say it was one of his daughters, others suggest it may have been a student, or even a trusted nurse Jung had a conversation. A quiet one, unrecorded, undocumented, but deeply remembered. He spoke not of fear, not of endings, but of transformation. Not transformation in a poetic sense, but a real soul-level metamorphosis. In that final exchange, Jung is said to have described an image, a sensation that he couldn't shake. "I saw myself standing in front of a door," he said, "but I couldn't go through it. I knew I wasn't finished." Let that sink in for a moment. Here is a man who spent his life exploring the deepest layers of the unconscious, who decoded dreams, battled shadows, and defined what it means to become whole. And yet, even as he stood on the threshold of death, he felt unfinished. That single sentence tells us everything about how Jung saw death, not as a punishment, not as darkness, but as a continuation of the soul's journey. A passageway, a portal, one that we're only ready to walk through when the soul is truly integrated. And what stopped him from entering that symbolic door It wasn't fear. It wasn't regret. It was truth. Jung had always taught that real transformation doesn't happen on the surface. It happens in the confrontation with what's hidden. And in that moment facing the door, he realized there was still more to integrate. That's powerful. Because most of us think death is binary. You're either alive or gone. But for Jung, death was symbolic. Death was the ultimate individuation. And the door, it wasn't a physical place. It was a mirror of the soul's readiness. You might be wondering, why didn't he write this down? Why didn't this conversation become part of his published works? That's what makes this story so haunting and so human. Jung believed that some truths couldn't be systematized. They couldn't be diagrammed or footnoted. Some truths had to be felt to be understood. And maybe that's why he only whispered them in quiet conversation to someone who was present enough to receive it. And here's the twist: the person he spoke to, whoever they were, did remember. And they passed it on, not in a headline, not in a best-selling book, but as a sacred story, a fragment, a spiritual clue left for us to piece together. That one sentence, "I was standing before a door, but I couldn't enter," has echoed for decades. It challenges how we see death. Because what if death doesn't care about your accomplishments, your degrees, or even your beliefs? What if death waits not for your resume, but for your readiness? What if you too are walking toward a door right now? And what's holding you back isn't the fear of death, but the parts of your soul you haven't yet reclaimed. Let me ask you something personal. Have you ever felt like you were standing at the edge of something big, something irreversible, and yet something inside you wasn't quite ready? Maybe it was a relationship you had to let go of. Maybe it was a version of yourself you had to shed. Maybe it was a dream that had to die so something deeper could be born. That's the energy Jung was describing. Death for him wasn't just a moment, it was a threshold. A place where the ego dissolves and only the essence remains. And if there are pieces of your essence still scattered, still hidden in the shadow, you're not ready to step through that door. This is why Jung spent so much of his life urging us to face our unconscious, to bring the shadow to light, to reclaim the lost parts of ourselves. Because only then, only when we are whole, can we die not in fear, but in truth. That final conversation, short as it was revealed, everything Jung had come to believe. That the soul is not erased in death, it is revealed. That death is not the end, it's the moment of clarity. And that we should spend our lives preparing not by fearing the unknown, but by knowing ourselves. He didn't describe the door as terrifying. He didn't talk about punishment, judgment, or reward. He spoke of completion, of integration, of a process not yet done. And if Carl Jung, the man who mapped the architecture of the unconscious, felt that he wasn't finished, maybe we can give ourselves permission to slow down and listen, to really ask ourselves, what parts of me are still hiding? What wounds am I still carrying that keep me from becoming whole? And if death were a door waiting for me, would I be ready to walk through? This isn't about religion. This isn't about doctrine. This is about the soul and its readiness to meet itself fully. Maybe that's why Jung kept this to a whisper. Maybe that's why he never wrote it down. Because some messages are meant to be felt, not explained. Now here's the part that might surprise you. Carl Jung, arguably one of the most prolific and detailed thinkers of the 20th century, spent his entire life writing, documenting, mapping the unconscious in symbols, dreams, archetypes, and theories. He built an entire inner cosmos through the written word. But in the final stretch of his life, he chose silence. not out of fear, not because he didn't have more to say, but because what he had left to share was in his own words, too sacred to be written down. There's a widely held theory shared by those close to him that Jung intentionally kept some of his deepest spiritual insights unrecorded. Not because they weren't real, but because they were too real. Because in his view, the most profound truths aren't meant to be read. They're meant to be experienced. Jung once said, "The most important things are the hardest to say, because words diminish them." He believed that certain truths, the kind that shake you to your core, lose something the moment they're pinned to paper. When we write them, we fix them in place. We turn something alive into something static. And for Jung, the soul was never static. That's why he was so drawn to symbols, dreams, and myth. They point to the truth without locking it down. They open a door, but never claim to explain what's behind it. And maybe that's why he never published the full account of his near-death vision. Why he never wrote a detailed explanation of that mysterious door he once stood before. Why that final conversation, the one about transformation after death, exists only as a whispered memory between souls. Jung was deeply aware of how the modern world tends to treat spiritual experiences. Try to write about the soul and someone will reduce it to brain chemistry. Speak about visions and people call them hallucinations. Talk about sacred truths and they're either dismissed by science or twisted by dogma. Jung didn't want that. He didn't want the mystery to be dissected. He didn't want his final insight to become another theory for academics to analyze or institutions to weaponize. He wanted it to stay alive. Something that could be passed down through story, through presence, through quiet knowing, not through textbooks. This might sound strange in our age of digital oversharing, where every thought becomes a post, every feeling becomes content. But for Jung, some things were too holy to explain. And if you think about it, that's not so different from ancient traditions. Across history, sacred knowledge was often passed on orally from teacher to student, elder to seeker. Not because people couldn't write, but because writing flattens things. It turns the mystical into the mechanical. It creates the illusion that just because you read something, you understand it. But understanding with the mind isn't the same as understanding with the soul. That's what Jung feared most, that his final insight, if written down, would be misunderstood. That it would be read with the head instead of felt with the heart. That it would become just another theory in a long list of spiritual ideas instead of the living flame it was meant to be. He even said once the soul speaks in images, and images resist logic. What is truly real does not lend itself to being explained. So what does that mean for us? It means that we are the inheritors of something intimate, something delicate. We've been given not a doctrine, not a definition, but a story, a fragment, a mystery. And maybe that's exactly how it was meant to be. Because maybe the real secret isn't what Jung saw after death. Maybe the real secret is that some things are only revealed when you're ready to feel them. And let's be honest, we live in a culture obsessed with answers. We want instant clarity, three-step solutions, and Google-able truth. But the soul doesn't work like that. It whispers, it waits, it invites. And that's what Jung left us with, an invitation. To stop seeking so much with the mind and start listening with the soul. It's easy to forget that this man who gave us the concepts of the collective unconscious, the anima and animus, the shadow and the self, still believed that the most important truths couldn't be diagrammed. He respected mystery. And that's something we need more of today. Because mystery humbles us, It reminds us that not everything needs to be explained. Some things just need to be honored and maybe trusted. So here's the question I'll leave with you. What truth have you felt in your bones but never been able to put into words? What part of your life feels more like a symbol than a sentence? Because maybe that's your soul speaking, and maybe like Jung, you're standing before your own sacred door, not quite ready to walk through it, but deeply aware that something is waiting on the other side. Something you can't explain. Something you're not meant to explain. Just something you're meant to remember. So what did Carl Jung really believe about death? Not in theory, not in metaphor, but in his final moments as a man who spent his life exploring the unconscious, sitting with archetypes, decoding symbols, and guiding others through their inner shadows. What did he more than anyone believe was on the other side? Here's the truth that may change how you see everything. Jung didn't see death as an end. He saw it as a revelation, the final awakening of the self. To him, the self wasn't just your personality or your story or your name. The self was the deepest, truest part of you, the part untouched by time, untouched by trauma, untouched by ego. And death in Jung's eyes wasn't a vanishing point. It was the moment when that self finally steps forward. In his private reflections, especially after his near-death experience, Jung stopped speaking of death as a biological event. Instead, he described it as a spiritual integration, a transition not from life to void, but from fragmentation to wholeness. And here's what's revolutionary about that. He didn't talk about heaven or hell. He didn't use the language of reward or punishment. Because for Jung, the real battle wasn't between good and evil. It was between consciousness and unconsciousness. Let me explain. All your life, you've been carrying layers. Ego, persona, fear, identity, childhood wounds, social roles. But beneath all of that lives something eternal, something whole, something sacred. Jung believed that as we live, we are meant to peel away those layers, not to destroy who we are, but to remember who we've always been. And death is the moment we are forced to face it all. It's not an ending, it's an unveiling, a moment where the unconscious becomes conscious, where the shadow stands fully visible, where everything we've avoided comes into the light, not to punish us, but to complete us. He once said, death is psychologically as important as birth, and like it is an integral part of life. To Jung, death was not about disappearing, it was about emerging. Now let's pause here because I want to ask you something personal. What if you've been thinking about death all wrong? What if it's not the great eraser, but the great revealer? Not the opposite of life, but the mirror that shows you how deeply you've actually lived. This is where Jung's insight becomes more than philosophy. It becomes a challenge. Because if death is the final integration, then the question isn't what happens after I die. The question is, how much of myself have I made conscious before I get there? Let that sit for a moment. Because here's the hard truth Jung left us with, one he whispered in private conversations, one he hinted at, but never fully wrote down. The afterlife, in his view, isn't a location. It's not a paradise or punishment. It's a state of realization. And if you arrive at the threshold of death, still fragmented, still in denial, still suppressing your inner truth, then your journey isn't over. This is why Jung didn't walk through the door in his vision. Not because he was unworthy, not because he was afraid, but because even after a lifetime of inner work, he knew there were still pieces of himself waiting to be claimed. That's not a failure. That's honesty. And maybe that's the most sacred thing he ever taught us. So many of us live like we're running out of time. trying to achieve, prove, survive. But Jung is asking a deeper question. Are you becoming whole? Because if death is the moment when your soul steps fully into itself, then wholeness isn't a luxury. It's a necessity. That doesn't mean perfection. That doesn't mean sainthood. It means facing the parts of you that you've exiled. The inner child you forgot, the dream you buried, the shadow you feared, the love you refused, the truth you ran from. To Jung, death was the final return to essence, a shedding of masks, a homecoming to the self. He once wrote, "As far as we can discern, the sole purpose of human existence is to kindle a light in the darkness of mere being." And that's what death is, the moment that light either shines fully or flickers in fragmentation. So what does this mean for us here now, still breathing? It means we have time. Time to turn inward. Time to bring light to our shadows. Time to ask the big questions, not just about the world, but about ourselves. It means we don't have to wait until the final hour to wake up. Because what Jung saw at the edge of death is something we can prepare for in life. And here's the gift he left us. You don't need a temple vision. You don't need to be standing at the edge of death to begin. You can start now. Start asking, what part of me am I still hiding? What truth have I been afraid to face? What would it mean to live as if I were preparing to become whole? Because maybe death isn't something that happens to us. Maybe death is the final step in a journey we've been walking all along. And the more aware we become, the more of ourselves we retrieve. The more conscious we grow, the more graceful our passage will be. Jung didn't fear death. He respected it. And he prepared for it, not by avoiding it, but by living fully awake. And that might be the secret he never wrote down. So what do we take away from all of this? Carl Jung's final conversation wasn't just a passing moment before death. It was a window into the soul, into the self, and into what lies beyond this life. Even though he never wrote it down, what he shared in those last quiet moments has traveled through time, through the memories of those who heard him, through the students who carried his wisdom, and through the body of work he left behind. And maybe that's the real power of a sacred truth. It doesn't need ink to live on. It lives in the questions it leaves behind. It lives in the parts of us that feel it, even if we can't explain it. Jung didn't just talk about death. He lived his philosophy to the very end. And even in silence, he offered something unforgettable. A reminder that death is not the final chapter. It's not a full stop. It's a return, a revelation, a coming home to who we truly are. And maybe that's why his words weren't written. Because some things are meant to be remembered, not read, lived, not labeled. So let me ask you, have you ever felt it? That quiet knowing when you face something unknown, that death isn't a disappearance, but a transformation. Maybe it showed up in a dream. Maybe in the loss of someone you loved. Maybe in a moment of stillness when everything just made sense for a heartbeat. Or maybe it's something you're feeling right now. If this video stirred something in you, if it made you feel less afraid, more curious, or more connected, then you're not alone. Let me know in the comments. Have you ever sensed that death is more than just an ending? And if this message reached a part of you that words usually can't subscribe, because here we don't just talk about life and death. We explore what's beneath the surface. Carl Jung once said, "Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakens." So let's keep looking in. Because sometimes the secrets that aren't written down are the ones that were meant for you to uncover.